We're good? All right. Welcome, everybody. The sound is working. Yeah, we're excited. Thank you so much for joining us at Baltimore Innovation Week. So we are currently and formerly technically a tech and innovation, entrepreneurship, etc. news site that this year is celebrating our 10th year reporting on Baltimore. So very exciting for us. Thank you so much. So my name is Julie Zeglin. I'm current managing editor at Technically. I am not based in Baltimore, but I'm very happy to be here today. I've been in this role for a couple of years, so I've worked with two-thirds of the people here, and we'll soon be joined by our now recently former Baltimore reporter, Dante Kirby. He's running a little late, but he'll be here shortly. So before we get started, I also want to call attention to this beautiful social media wall behind us. You too can appear on this wall if you use the hashtag BMR Tech 10. This is a compilation of people who recorded videos saying thanks to us, partly to our reporting of the last 10 years, but also sharing a headline that they want to see 10 years from now in Baltimore. So you can think about that and what you would write for your headline. So in this next 40 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about our reflections on the last 10 years of Baltimore tech, how the city has changed, and especially how the entrepreneurship community has changed, and the big themes that we saw in our reporting over that time. We'll also be looking forward to what we expect the future of Baltimore tech will look like. So we will start in chronological order. Andrew Zaleski was our very first reporter in Baltimore back in 2012. Could you please intro yourself? Talk about what you've been working on since then.
This works, right? Yeah. So I was the first reporter in Baltimore. I started in June 2012, and I was here until about June 2014. And since then, I'm just a freelance writer. I write for a bunch of different magazines. Not really about tech anymore. Sorry, but is that good?
It's great. Yeah, thank you. Stephen Babcock, longtime reporter and editor in Baltimore. How about you?
Hey everyone, Stephen Babcock. I served as an editor and a reporter and probably a couple other things over about 8 years from 2014 up until the end of last year, basically. By the way, it's great to see so many people who are a part of this journey with us here today. So thanks everyone for coming out. And now I'm running a new e-commerce focused media site called The Current.media, if anyone wants to visit it, if you're interested in commerce and the future of retail. So.
Let's see. Nope. All right. Well, at least this is cut off less than Steven's mic did. So, yeah. I'm Samir Rao. I am currently Technically's editor in Baltimore, overseeing Baltimore and DC coverage. And since Dante, who will be here shortly, has left Technically, I've also been reporting for our Baltimore and I've done since joining Technically in February. Before that, I was a reporter for publications, including Color Lines, North 60, and freelance in a couple. It all.
We're having some
We can
mic
just like
issues.
split these two if that works.
It's fine. Cool. Great. So again, 2012, very different scene than we have now. We're going to talk about how that's evolved. Andrew, can you tell us what was one of the first stories you remember reporting when you started here? This is like, again, summer 2012. You were new to this beat. What were you focusing on?
If I just talk without the mic, without the feedback, can people hear me? Is that good? Yeah. Okay. Okay. 2012. Gosh, one of the first stories I remember reporting was this group of guys who started up a tie sharing service. That was one, like literally neckties. If you need a necktie, come get it. But probably over the course of that year, I remember writing a variety of bigger things. This is around the time when Uber showed up in Baltimore, and Yellow Cab did not like that. So Uber and Yellow Cab got into a big fight with each other. This is also the time when we tried to sort of figure out what the cybersecurity scene in Baltimore looked like, because there are a lot of companies here, but we weren't quite sure how many actual employees of those companies lived in Baltimore City. So we looked at that. That was one of the bigger stories. Those are two that come to mind. I don't know if that's what you're sort of looking for.
Yeah, Stephen, how'd you pick those stories up once you came on as reporter?
Oh, well, I think, for one, there was, and oh. There was definitely a kind of an explosion of, smaller startups that were coming and were forming in the city, right? But what we eventually found was they were also kind of coalescing around specific hubs, right? So you would have, like the ETC was one of those where, not only startups would come and work here, but then they would all, they'd have happy hour, there'd be people stopping by for meetings, and they kind of became these like centers of activity for the tech scene. And while I was a lead reporter from very early on, there was kind of this also explosion of the spaces, right, that were of those different kinds of spaces that were forming, right? So you not only had, as Andrew mentioned, there was cybersecurity, that's kind of one community that is kind of an outgrowth of the NSA being based in Maryland, right? And there are a lot of startups that come as a result of that. We also have biotech in Baltimore, Hopkins in Maryland, and they both built massive spaces. When you look at the biopark over here, Johns Hopkins 1812, the lab space that they have, that's all fairly new still, right, in the past decade. I mean, that kind of is that example of economic growth and in the city and how tech is really tied to that. So just seeing and then we also had OpenWorks was doing, hard physical goods and offering makers a space to do that. Impact Hub took a focus on social innovation. So there is a wide variety. The tech got big enough where it could kind of have these subcategories of the scene, so to speak, I think, was definitely the case. And as that kind of evolved, each of those spaces started to get bigger and kind of formed their own communities, within that larger community in some sense. And obviously, it's a city, right? There's people that cross between all different sides of those, but it was just really interesting to, how there wasn't only one tech community in a lot of cases. So.
Samir and Stephen, you can both comment on this, but a lot of Dante's beat when he came on, Dante Kirby joined us as a Report for America Corps member in summer 2020. A lot of his beat was focused on digital access, DEI initiatives around the Baltimore tech community. Stephen, maybe you can comment on why we decided to focus his beat on that, and then Samir, you could talk about what those initiatives look like nowadays.
Yeah, I think, it was really interesting how we often saw the technology community was also this, sub branch of the local economy, right? And I think some of that you can tie back to say that's Baltimore's digital economy in a sense, right? And what we saw was, the part of being involved in the local digital economy meant, there were questions of access that kept coming up, right? We often found that, actually there are, the level of, the exact study from the Able Foundation about the internet, the people in Baltimore who are connected to the internet was 40% of people, lack wireline access. 40% of households lack wireline access to the internet. And so there's this question of, the tech community is growing a ton, but we also want to cover how people are getting access to that, right? And the reality is that there were gaps there. And I think, to report on those is different than, in some ways, than kind of saying, okay, we're a business publication that's focused only on kind of these like up and coming startups and these questions of valuations and fundraising and profit. But when you're talking about expanding internet access, that's the city government's involved in that, right? That's in some ways the education system is involved in that, right? In a lot of ways, it's about working with different coalitions of people throughout the city. And I think we really saw that the tech, it couldn't only be about tech, but there was more broad questions of access and how everyone in the city was kind of entering this economy. And so we wanted to go out and answer those questions. And it was, we had kind of written up that proposal, and the Able Foundation study came out, I think, in 2020, maybe early, and then the pandemic happened, right? And And I think that the reality of not having internet access was only driven home further at a time when everyone was not only relying on that for work, but also, to do many basic functions of life. And so I think it felt like it only grew in importance at that point. And what we also started to see was there was a lot more organizing energy around, working on these issues. Like all those same people that Andrew met the first time he went to Baltimore, or I met at the first Baltimore Innovation Week in 2014, immediately in the aftermath of, pandemic lockdowns, like turn their attention to focus on, how can we make sure that we get laptops to people? How can we make sure that we have Wi-Fi hotspots for folks? That organizing energy kind of turned to that issue. And, so it ended up being kind of this interesting, dovetail that we had that beat was kind of were getting more important. And by the way, I think these issues are going to continue to be really important, and there's also a ton of money that's about to get invested in this through the infrastructure bill, through Baltimore City with ARPA, the money that they're getting from the federal government, basically really important issues, and they have these things that are, informing them like never before. So accountability is going to be even more important.
Just a quick set, we're continuing even without Steven around, without Dante around, to cover these topics. Dante, both under Steven and while I was his editor, really opened the door in a lot of senses, I think, to covering a lot of digital equity issues that are very intimately related to some of the other kinds of more, maybe I guess you could say, like business first or tech first things that are a bit more quote unquote central to what Technically does in terms of like its original mission on this world. And you see sort of evidence of that in the way that we talk about DEI in the sector, STEM pipelines, and how we're sort of building our next generation of STEM workers in this city, and developers and tech professionals and entrepreneurs. So we've been covering a bit of that through, and I guess my lens now is sort of trained on what is going to be the effect of these ARPA dollars, of other infrastructure related bills that are getting distributed through the city, through foundations, through all these other entities, or in some cases like distributed directly to some of these entities that then work with companies or work, have accelerators or whatever, and just trying to get a sense of what equity sort of looks like in the city, or digital equity looks like in the city now that there is perhaps more money from the government and the private sector than ever before, or at least more interest from investors on, DEI related things or projects and companies that focus on fixing social inequities. So yeah. It continues to evolve, but it continues to be a priority, is I guess the simplest way of saying it.
Cool, thanks. So let's talk a little bit about industries of 2012 now and all throughout. So Andrew, starting with you again. You called this out a little bit, I think. What were some of the bigger? Hey, Dante, everybody, welcome Dante Kirby. Yeah. Dante, I'll let you get settled, but we'll have you intro yourself in a minute. So Andrew, comment on some of the industries that were big at the time, or that were even coalescing, some of the companies that were itty bitty there then and bigger now. Or honestly, I would love to hear about everybody thought this was going to be huge in Baltimore and it just did not happen industry-wise.
2012 was, it's kind of a cliche to say literally a different time, but we got set up here about 6 weeks after Facebook goes public. So I think a lot of the early scene in Baltimore was kind of surveying who might actually be big based on what had come before. So there was Millennial Media, there was Ad.com, there are guys like Greg Cangelosi who had done big exits, Dave Troy sold ToadNet. So we sort of thought maybe it's going to be advertising tech, maybe it'll be something related to that. And then over time, you just start to see different sort of focuses emerge, like whether it's ed tech, whether it's fintech, the cybersecurity stuff was always big. But I think in those early days, it was a lot of, 1 or 2 person teams trying to just put a startup together and sort of see where they fit in. I don't know if there was necessarily one big thing at the time.
Yeah, I think where, the way it was kind of always presented to me, I remember when I first, I think it was Jason Hardebeck was running Dream It Health, which was like an accelerator for health IT companies at the time. And I remember I saw him give this public presentation that was, for me, that was like the intro to Baltimore, right, to the tech scene. And he was like, the main basics, subcategories, so to speak, are education technology, advertising technology, cybersecurity, and life sciences, right? And those each make sense, right? Because I mean, those kind of like flow up to like what are the dominant kind of industries in the local economy in Baltimore, right? You have cybersecurity, huge hub at Fort Meade, right? Life sciences, I mentioned with universities. Education technology, a really interesting base of kind of companies who were pioneers, right? In ed tech based here in Baltimore, and that gave you Laureate Education, which still is going around, and a bunch of others that kind of spun out of that. So I think we were kind of all looking to those similarly, but what another thing that was kind of the undercurrent that was happening around that maybe when you started and when I was kind of first taking the reins was the App Store, Apple App Store, right? There was still the promise that you could build an app and monetize that, and that was kind of the ticket to stardom, so to speak, right? And I think as things kind of expanded, in my time, think about the amount you hear about AI right now. That's only really been like in the past 5 or 7 years that's exploded as a use case, and there's all these different use cases for serving businesses through those data tools, through those data science tools and analytics. And that's just kind of exploded, So I think, in a lot of ways, we're not looking as much for to a specific industry because yes, those are going to be kind of established. Some of those are going to be established through what we already have in the local economy. But it's also what is the next generation of technologies that is really going to inform how businesses come about, because this Baltimore is a city like any other, right? And I think it's really interesting the way I see now, as I was kind of getting ready to go out, one of the startups I was watching was Eureka Labs, and it was interesting to me how they had kind of spun out of the Salesforce ecosystem. They started by serving people within Salesforce, right? And then they kind of were able to build a business on that. Similar to the way, in that back in the day, you could build an app on the Apple App Store and kind of get it out that way, right? So it's interesting how these things kind of go in cycles.
Dante, I'd love to have you introduce yourself a bit. We talked a little bit about what you focused on in your beat, but from your perspective, would love to hear a little bit about the biggest stories or biggest themes that you covered in your time at Technically. And also, everyone shared one of the first big stories that they remember writing, or a big initial trend or theme that you covered early on.
Okay. But I guess to start, name is Dante Kirby. I was the lead Baltimore reporter, I guess, from the start of the pandemic to a month ago. And I guess the big trend that I remember seeing in the beginning, y'all were talking a lot about ed tech, and that was actually something I probably didn't see that often unless we were talking about it from a training for tech jobs perspective. I know Catalyte got pretty big, or I had a few big stories on their growth and that okay, we have remote work is rising and all of these STEM jobs need people. We're the place to go to come fill it. So that was the big thing along education wise. And me personally, I covered a lot of digital equity things. And in the pandemic that mostly took the shape of who had internet and who didn't, but it could also be around who gets the VC money, who doesn't, who gets the engineering job, who doesn't. Well, I think the big story, at least I like to think from the start, was Google and somebody who was from Baltimore who got told her Baltimore accent ability. And I've talked to this woman, and she talks way more proper than I do, and she's 5'2" tops. But her Baltimore accent was considered threatening, and that was the big story for me that I feel sort of started and shaped the beat. around, again, digital Act 3 topics. And when I think about, like, y'all talking about the industries that sort of I saw a lot in my trend was centered a lot around, like, civic tech and what Fearless is doing. I think that was, like, when I think of your Eureka Labs, or I forgot what you were covering that you saw were big, but, like, Fearless was probably the one that was, like, I kept seeing it get big deal after big deal, and it made it sort of shape my coverage around, like, okay, civic tech and government contracting and, like, what that looks like. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. So you touched on this a bit. I want to talk about entrepreneurial resources. You mentioned, like, who gets VC dollars, who gets connections, but more broadly, thinking about the resources that are available in Baltimore to people who are looking to start companies, that has changed over the past decade as well. So thinking about eras, we had Accelerate Baltimore, Baltimore Angels early on. Institutions got more involved. Now there's a group of local funds, big money funds. We have Upsurge. We have a couple other organizations that are focused specifically on Baltimore. So Andrew, going back to the early days again. So what do you remember as, like, Tech Breakfast was something that you covered early on, for instance? Like, what were some of the convening resources available to people starting companies?
Yeah, so in terms of publicity, it was Tech Breakfast, if anyone remembers Ron Schmelzer, when they would do those every month. I mean, the funding situation was always the big question. There was Accelerate Baltimore. There were the Angels. I know over time, people like Vince Talbert and Frank Bolsonaro got a little more involved in it, but I think that was always the biggest thing. And I think for a while there in the beginning, the reason why people started trying to convene more stuff in Baltimore was because I think the feeling was you had to go out west, go get your money, and then maybe you could come back here because there wasn't a whole lot of money available. Unless you were one of those big companies or one of those people who did an exit just from building a company in Baltimore. And that's probably what's changed. There was so much disparate stuff when I was here. Like, some of these companies never even heard of because I haven't been here since 2014. And I think that's what's changed. In the beginning, it was a bunch of little things trying to figure out how you can actually do anything here. And now it seems much more mature, at least based on what you guys are saying.
Oh, yeah. Wait, so we're just picking that up.
Yeah.
I think the funding situation has definitely, I think there were just more, the initial kind of, like, really, really early seed capital that you could get to kind of go explore your idea a little bit. I'm talking about, like, when you just, are kind of at the level of a $10, $25, $50,000 check kind of helps you, that kind of got, that there was a lot more effort to get that to people, I think, right? So I've been to many big check award presentations at demo days. They were just giving out the big checks of $25,000. I think we had a lot. And then what we saw was that there were actually more VC firms that started to be formed specifically here in the city, and I think that some of that was an outgrowth of, when entrepreneurs have a successful outcome, what you can do with that is go back and invest that into the new crop of startups, right? So, see Margaret's here. Guy Filippelli had Red Owl Analytics and now founded Squadra Ventures, which is investing in another wave, right? I think when you kind of see that ecosystem cycle going, kind of starting to fulfill itself, then that kind of builds over time. And I think we'll see more of that, but I do think that there's an interesting aspect of you can still go elsewhere and find funding and then grow from a base in Baltimore. But as a VC, you can also build from a base in Baltimore and look elsewhere as well, right? So I think the pandemic kind of reshaped a little bit of, I heard from investors who said they're taking Zoom meetings was actually much easier as far as, their ability to, meet with lots and lots of people. And obviously during the early days of the pandemic, very frothy investment market. So I think that kind of, sped things up a little bit in some respects. So it'll be interesting for me to see how things kind of continue to evolve now that we're back in person a little bit more. on the capital markets. But I do think that the number of resources that grew out of those, I talked about all those spaces before that came up in Baltimore where people were kind of congregating, and each one of those has also become a resource hub, right? Whether they're offering funding, whether they're offering mentorship, whether they're offering kind of, a program that like ETC offers with Accelerate Baltimore, where it is like this, 12-week accelerator program. Those things kind of, so not only did you kind of have that real estate that got formed, but there were more and more resources that came up as well. So.
I just want to briefly add. So technically covers Philly, Baltimore, DC, Delaware, and Pittsburgh as markets, which are all not Silicon Valley. They're all not New York City or Boston on purpose because they are growing and interesting and have a lot of on-the-ground work happening. Coalescing around the smaller tech scenes that are happening there. Something that we did hear across the board during the pandemic was that small companies, any company looking for venture capital, was finding it easier to raise money from non-local investors. It became less important to try to find somebody who would invest in them in their own city because you could just take a Zoom call from somebody who happens to be based in Silicon Valley. The question then is that we are thinking about daily throughout the pandemic and now and forever, then how does place matter in terms of raising money? We can talk about that too, but that's a big thing that we grappled with during the pandemic that I think everyone in any entrepreneurial ecosystem grappled with too. But you guys, do you want to add anything about resources, entrepreneurial resources?
I guess, I'll quickly tie to the first article that I wrote for Technically, which was just a recap of the demo day that Techstars and Upsurge Baltimore had for the Equitech Accelerator class, which for me, I think set a stage in terms of like what my lens has been here. Not only because race and racial equity have been these sort of like hallmarks of things I've done throughout my career as a reporter covering not tech. I mean, this is my first tech journalism job, but it also, I think, set for me this sort of platform of understanding, well, who are the companies that are getting some amount of attention from not only local investors, but like a broader national, international entity like Techstars. There were a couple of companies in that accelerator who were not based here, but said from the stage that they were going to be doing very intentional hiring here or even relocate here. Not all of that has panned out, I don't think, but at least some of what that showed to me was that there was some interest in companies being based here, and that there was an audience that was ready to hear that companies were relocating here. So, and particularly companies that follow this Equitech vision that Upsurge has sort of set out of, doing things in an equitable way that can kind of build this city and develop and quote unquote revitalize the city through a lens of equity and inclusion, and do it in a way that isn't like what's been done in Silicon Valley, where like it became cool, all the rents rose, and the people that made it cool don't get to live there anymore. So like, I think that for me, what it did set in stone was this sense of there's interest in Baltimore that had not existed for at least a couple of years. And as people were making this return to in-person events and dealing with the reality of what it's like to have like decentralized companies or companies that hire from across the country, hire from across the world, something about tying yourself to Baltimore still made enough sense in the context of an event that had like an international, national player like Techstars. So I don't know if that quite answers the question, but that is like something that I feel like I've seen as a trend. What I will say is one of the companies in that accelerator, Ecomap Technologies, made a great resource that they debuted a couple months ago. That was like a sort of map of resources to access in Baltimore for people who want to found companies here. It was I think done in collaboration or in partnership with Upsurge, and it was released as a physical guide, but exists as a digital guide, released as a physical guide at a like 1-year anniversary event that Upsurge Baltimore had a couple months back in Pigtown. So I think the fact that like these kinds of resources exist, like it makes me wonder if such like, I obviously wasn't here, but maybe such centralization of resources in a sort of digestible, easy to access way maybe didn't exist in the same way back when y'all were working at Technically, or if it did, it wasn't as accessible or as centralized, which means maybe there wasn't that same level of interest to drive it. I think that feels new.
I guess we're talking about like the ecosystem as a whole and like how it's changed resource wise. I know I remember hearing Jason Hardebeck talk about it. Talked to the Mind Grub CEO. He talked about it similarly. And it's what I see with like my new beat in DC, like that same thing of like the ecosystem now is, I guess, fuller than it was before, or like it was more complete now than it was 10 years ago, where you could go from pre-seed to seed to Series A and get that exit. And the main issue is that like there hasn't been as many big exits from Baltimore as much anymore, because I guess the way it works is that somebody does a big exit, become an angel investor, and they sort of like cycle that money back into the community. And that sort of goes back to, okay, Fearless is getting big, and now it has Hutch, which builds a bunch of other civic tech companies. So now it feels like, okay, this is a civic tech place. Or Mind Grub gets big and starts doing its own investing, and now it feels like, okay, now digital services seems like a thing to do here. When you were talking about, I guess, ad.com, you thought it was going to be ad tech because they got so big and those angel investors are interested in the companies like that. So I guess that's really the big thing, where like the resources have changed because those companies have gotten big and reached back. So sometimes I think about my mind of like, oh, this is like a place for social entrepreneurship, as they call it, because I see places like Conscious Venture Labs and how they invest in people and entrepreneurs or innovation work. So it makes me think the system is full there. But I can also hear on the other side for like every company that went through, let's say Techstars, Equitex, and wants to come in here because they feel like they get so much help and resource as entrepreneurs at that pre-seed, seed level, and they feel like, oh, I get connections here that I can't get in a way in New York City. There's companies who are like born and raised here, like B360, who feel like, oh, I have to leave to get the recognition I want, or I got to leave to get the funding that I'm looking for, because it always looks like it's shinier when it's from outside the community. So it like, I guess there's a dichotomy there about resources. But I guess it always comes back to the same question of like, companies might know how to get pre-seed or seed money, but they don't know how to get the Series A money. Or if they're at the Series A stage, they feel like they got to go somewhere else to exit. So I guess that's the same thing I'm hearing here as what I hear in DC. So I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Thanks. I want to give you all a chance to ask questions. We'll do that in a couple minutes. But I want to also ask our panelists the question that was asked on the Sylvie social media wall. We asked everybody to answer the question, what's a headline that you want to see in 10 years? So I'd love to hear that from each of you, and also if you think that it will come true, or what needs to happen to make that headline happen. Anyone can answer first. I know I keep putting Andrew on it first.
I will, in case you didn't watch my video on the internet, I will give a little recitation of that. My headline for what I would like to see in the next 10 years is Baltimore's population grows by 6%. And 6% is an important number because we just had the census came out 2010, which counts the population from 2010 to 2020. And that showed that Baltimore's population fell by 6%. So I think I would love in a decade to see growth. And, I think there are a number of ways that we can do that. First, there's a policy level, right? I think, there's things when an interesting thing that came out after that census data came out was that Philly, DC, some of the surrounding cities here actually grew during that time, right? So, and what's one difference that between those cities and us is there is public transportation that's robust and it's connected to job hubs and, makes it easy to go between neighborhoods, right? So if we work more on building that, that could be a way. There's things we can do as a business community, right? That we can, make it very welcoming for businesses when they move here and when they're just starting out to grow here, right? I mean, I think that's when you look at the tech community, and that's something that I always was benefited a lot from, I felt like, was people were just always kind of willing to, sort of show you the lay of the land and bring you in and kind of even make a few intros for you, like help out, even when they didn't have to, right? So extending that to everything that we do. And on a personal level, I think we can also when we talk to people from outside of Baltimore, talk it up. Like, give your honest take, of course. We're Baltimore. Like, we're going to tell people how it really is. But, tell people what it's like living here. Like, let's not talk about, like, what the perception is. Let's talk about what it's really like to live here.
In Philly,
this concludes my TED Talk.
Thank you. Baltimore's biggest fan, Stephen Babcock. I live in Philly, and the thing that we do hype and we're told to hype is like the affordability, public transportation, arts and culture, and restaurant scene. Are those the same, or are there any overlaps for Baltimore?
Well, I think we have all of those things, actually.
Sure.
Julie, funny you should mention.
I bring it up 'cause it's a little bit funny because it is just like in every article that's like, all right, and what's your pitch for this place? Like, that's what founders say. And it's like, yeah, we like those things. It's true. Is that the main reason people come? I don't know, but it's nice to say.
A very distinct local culture, yet we have proximity to the centers of the world. But it's very comfortable to live here and affordable as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say something similar in terms of like when I boast about this city. I mean, I wrote when I was at the Sun as an arts and entertainment reporter. I wrote an op-ed that I think is still pinned to the top of my Twitter, where I was like, "There's a great sense of what feels like a sense of compassion and like understanding and a willingness to speak truth to power in at least some aspects of our music scene. That like, if you look at the music scene, you'll see more moral leadership in Baltimore than you do from our politicians. Now, granted, this was in 2020." We can debate later to the extent to which that's changed in the past 2 years, but I do think that we offer a lot of assets that aren't very clear, and it sort of dovetails in with what I would want to see is like the headline in 10 years, which is like Baltimore ranked by some national entity like top city in the country for entrepreneurs of color. Not that we like necessarily need national recognition, but it would be nice, I think, to sort of have Baltimore recognized for what it is and what it can be as a like city that is the birthplace of redlining, but also is a place where you see entrepreneurs of color, Black entrepreneurs, Asian American ones, Latinx ones, doing really interesting things that there might not necessarily, if they were to pitch this in San Francisco, they'd be paying more for office space. The investors might not see the market case in the same way. So I think that is something I would love to see. To what extent we're going to be able to get there. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that someone's come with a bunch of money, said Baltimore can be transformed, and then nothing like substantive happened to stop almost half the population from like living in endemic poverty that they've been living in since all the racist policies that led to that divestment in their neighborhoods in the first place. When our primary like private educational institution is also like the birthplace of a lot of white supremacist rhetoric that made its way into national politics. I think there's a lot of history that we have to like kind of go through and really confront, but we are confronting it in some ways. And I think that there is a way that the city can transform equitably and overcome some of these perceptions that are, to me, are really about the city being predominantly Black. Because like, I don't know, I go places and I say I live in Baltimore and people are like, oh my God, The Wire is such a great show. And like, I would never talk to someone from Los Angeles and be like, oh, The Shield was such a great show. Meet someone from Harlem and be like, Juice is such a great movie. Like, no one thinks about these cities in these way in the popular eye because they have so much glitz and glamour to kind of distract you from the poverty that every American city deals with. But like, here it somehow characterizes our national reputation in a way that I don't see as often with other American cities. And I think that is a perception that we can overcome if we really show the rest of the country, there's a different way to do things. That was my TED Talk.
I guess I was born and raised in Philadelphia, and Baltimore feels a lot like Philadelphia, except like just dramatically smaller. And I mean, when I think about the thing I want to see 10 years from now on the headline, is that it's like a top 10 STEM, like Baltimore high schools ranked top 10 in STEM education. which I see like a very real possibility when you look at the surrounding areas of, you have like the DOD in the area, you have like all of these tech companies trying to work for these big government agencies, and they need like, they need employees and skills, or people who are skilled to work in these fields and jobs. And I feel like there's a lot of organizations that could like push that to the forefront. I mean, when I think about the people who are running for the school board council today, like Andrew Coy, who just got on it, and other people who have tech backgrounds sort of working towards winning that election, I feel like it's a very real possibility that there could be like change in this school board. I guess to keep going along the lines of like how I've seen Baltimore from living here for the past 2 years, it's mostly been through the pandemic. So I feel like I've kind of only lived here for like a solid 6 months. But yeah, I feel a lot of grit, and there's definitely, when I look at the community of entrepreneurs that I've seen and covered here, that they're very mission oriented in a way that I was not expecting. And there was like a big thought of like not just how they can, I guess, improve the profit motive, but like how can they can actually help, whether it be from a civic tech angle, how can they improve the government, from like a local community angle of like how can they use tech to improve their neighborhoods around them. It's just always been inspiring to see.
I didn't really come up with a headline for the video. I mean, probably just to reiterate what Steven said. I mean, the story of Baltimore the last 70 years has been one of population loss. Baltimore in the 1950s has 950,000 people. It was the 5th largest city in this country, and it's largely because of Sparrows Point and the steel manufacturing that we did here. And of course, the problem that emerges once steel goes by the wayside is that all of these stable middle-class jobs that lifted up all of the neighborhoods in Baltimore are suddenly gone. I think tech can certainly play a role in bringing that back, but you know, anyone who lives in Baltimore knows about the white L and the black butterfly. And the problem there could be that you bring in so much of this tech stuff that you tend to forget everything else. I mean, that's like DC. You go to DC now, and the DC of today is vastly different from the DC of the 1980s. So it'd be nice to see population growth, because in 2012, that was the really big buzzy thing in the news, the fact that Baltimore finally surpassed 620,000 people after decades of being under that. And now I think we're sub 600,000. So it'd be nice to see more people here, but I don't really know the way you do that so that there is some sort of equitable distribution of resources and talent and companies and, you know, frankly, just places for people to get jobs. I don't know. That's not really an uplifting note, so I'll just stop there.
Appreciate that, though. We started a little late. I hope we have time for a couple questions, or honestly comments if anybody has ideas about that last thing that we just talked about. Yeah, with the laptop. Yeah. How can it be seen internationally? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I think it takes probably a certain amount of these things that have been done to try and cultivate that sense of an international innovation workforce in the city kind of has to continue. But I also think that it maybe takes a certain amount of creative branding in a certain way in terms of how outreach is done to other people who maybe entities that want to invest in the ecosystem here, because, you know, I guess for me, it comes from this sense of like, when I moved here in 2018 from Philadelphia, and I joke with people like, when I was in Philly, I had a hard time convincing my friends from New York to come down and see all the great things that are there. And I grew up in New England, so I have a lot of friends in New York. That's where they ended up when we left Connecticut. But now I have the problem of trying to convince all my friends in Philly to see what's great about here, even though it's like they're very similar cities with very similar issues, and even they just look similar. But I think that what it is, these are all people who are looking for better solutions in their lives and better places to live where they can live comfortably, where they're not like having to spend like 90% of their paycheck on rent or like watch their, the housing prices go up and up and up and they can't keep up. Like, I think that this city can offer something to people that really want to be intentional about building something that works for them and allows them to thrive without hurting the huge, predominantly black sections of the city that will inevitably get hurt if we pursue a model like what our other cities on the northeastern seaboard have pursued, right? I don't want Baltimore to look like DC. That doesn't look like success to me. So I think that it's probably just a mix of that, and I don't know exactly what the exact like alchemy of resources with demand or opportunity is, but I think that we are seeing a little bit of solutions with things like the Equitech Accelerator. I think that things like that, if they prove to be successful in like bringing companies here, and that will then hire locally or create programs or fund programs to develop STEM talent in West Baltimore and East Baltimore, I think that hopefully can be scaled up in a way that will continue to improve the city's, I guess, like brand as a hub of innovation, which it already clearly is. I mean, we can see it's just how do we bring it to more people is I think what we need to figure out.
Just one quick note on that too. I think there's another part of this too, which is if we want to be on the global stage, Baltimore needs to show up on the global stage. And I think going there and representing, like, I think there was one year in 2015 or 2016, I can't remember, South by Southwest, and I remember Kevin Plank gave a keynote at South by Southwest, and and then behind him, this wasn't coordinated in any way, but there was a big crew, right, that was there too. And I think just the ability to talk about the city to others, I think Sean has been involved in work to get people out to the Startup Grinds big conference. We're showing up as a delegation. I think some of the folks in Maryland Cyber have said, okay, let's band together and go to the big, industry conference in that, but let's actually plant a flag, literally, right, for Maryland's like on the floor. So, and, I think the Department of Commerce is also taking people to various bio conferences around the world, So when we see people really who are, showing up on that global stage and just, at these conferences, like telling people what it's like that actually is impactful. And that's kind of what I was talking about with how the personal can be global. But I think we got to wrap.
We do got to wrap. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We're gonna be hanging out for the rest of the day working, and you can catch us right after the panel if you want to chat. Heard. Thank you, Deb. All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panelists. We'll be around. Have a great rest of your day.
Also, for those of you who've been on this journey with us, we have some old BIW programs from 2015 to 2017 if you want to take them as like, personal collector items.
Time capsule. Come on.
Please take them is what I'm trying to say.